Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're diving into a classic that you sent our way, Buddenbrooks,
Buddenbrooks
by Thomas Mann.
by Thomas Mann.
You already know it's a hefty book, but what makes it so compelling?
Well, think of it as a slow-burning tragedy. Mann takes us on this journey through 4 generations of a wealthy merchant family in 19th century Germany. The Buddenbrooks.
The Buddenbrooks.
On the surface, it's a story about their decline, but underneath, Mann explores these profound themes of societal change, the tension between tradition and modernity, and the struggles of individuals caught in the midst of those shifts.
Okay, so it's not just about rich people problems.
It's not at all. Think about it. The Buddenbrooks are like a microcosm of society itself, as the world around them transforms, politically, economically, even culturally. They grapple with questions of identity, legacy, and what it means to be successful in a changing world. Those are questions we still ask today.
Right, I see that. So where does this grand saga begin?
It all starts in 1835 with the Buddenbrooks at the peak of their power. They've just moved into a lavish new home in the German town of Lübeck, and they throw this grand housewarming party to celebrate.
You mentioned this lavish party. What struck you most about how Mann portrays this event?
The contrast. Mann goes into great detail describing the house. It's opulent, grand, meant to showcase their wealth and status. But there's this curious detail he keeps returning to, a simple iron stove in the midst of all this luxury.
Why focus on the stove? What's so special about it?
It's almost like a subtle foreshadowing. The stove represents the family's roots, their humble beginnings. It's a reminder that even amidst all this opulence, there's a vulnerability, a fragility at the core of their existence.
I see what you mean. It's like a crack in the perfect facade, hinting at something darker lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly, and that sense of unease is further heightened by the characters themselves. We meet the patriarch, Johann Buddenbrooks Sr., his elegant wife, the consulin, and their children, Thomas, Christian, and Tony. Each of them, in their own way, embodies the internal conflicts that will eventually tear the family apart.
So even at this celebratory moment, Mann is planting seeds of their downfall.
Precisely. Think of the poem recited by the city poet Jean-Jacques Hofstede during the party. It's full of praise for the family's virtues, their contributions to Lübeck, their solid reputation. But even as Hofstede extols their virtues, there are characters like Herr Kuppen, who literally longs to loosen his waistcoat, yearning for a freedom that's denied him by the strict social etiquette of the time.
So it's like everyone's playing a part in this grand performance of wealth and respectability.
Yes, and Mann is subtly suggesting that these roles, these social constraints, can be suffocating, even for those who seem to benefit most from them.
That's a fascinating insight. It makes me wonder if the Buddenbrooks are truly happy, or if they're trapped by their own success.
That's the central question Mann wants us to grapple with. And to understand the weight of that question, we need to delve deeper into the family's past, as recorded in their meticulous ledger.
Ah, the famous Buddenbrook ledger. You mentioned this earlier. What makes this document so crucial to understanding the family's decline?
It's not just a record of their finances, though it does meticulously track every business dealing. It's more like a family Bible, detailing births, deaths, marriages, illnesses, even moral admonishments.
So it's their attempt to control their narrative, to shape how they're perceived, both by the world and by future generations.
Exactly. But it also reveals their anxieties, their obsession with documenting their lineage, their success. It's as if they're trying to hold on to something that's already slipping away.
Like clinging to the past, even as the world around them is changing.
Precisely. And nowhere is that struggle more evident than in the story of Tony, the Buddenbrooks' daughter.
Yes, let's talk about Tony. You mentioned her rebellious nature earlier. How does her story embody that conflict between tradition and modernity you were talking about?
Think of her as a woman born ahead of her time. She devours romantic literature, corresponds with a schoolboy, activities deemed inappropriate for a young woman of her social standing. And she constantly clashes with her family's expectations, particularly those of her mother, the consulin. The consulin, a product of her time, believes Tony's duty is to marry well to secure the family's social standing, and that leads to one of the most pivotal moments in the book, Tony's forced marriage to Bendix Grünlich, a businessman from Hamburg.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. Tony despises Grünlich. He represents everything she rebels against: materialism, social climbing, a lack of genuine passion. But she's pressured into the marriage for the sake of the family's reputation.
And this decision has a ripple effect, right? It sets in motion a chain of events that ultimately contribute to the Buddenbrooks' downfall.
Exactly. Tony's unhappiness in the marriage, her eventual divorce, it all chips away at the family's carefully constructed facade, but it also reveals a deeper societal shift that's underway.
What do you mean?
Well, Tony's yearning for love, for individual fulfillment, it reflects the changing expectations of women in the 19th century. She's not content to be a pawn in a game of social chess. She wants more from life, and her defiance, while ultimately tragic, also foreshadows the push for greater autonomy that women will fight for in the decades to come.
That's really insightful. It's like Mann is using Tony's personal struggles to comment on a larger social movement.
He is, and he doesn't shy away from portraying the consequences of those struggles. Tony's life becomes a series of compromises, of sacrifices made for the sake of family and tradition.
But it's not just Tony's story that highlights these changing times, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned political upheaval earlier. How does that play into the Buddenbrooks' decline?
The 1848 revolution, which swept across Europe, is a turning point in the novel. It literally shakes the foundations of Lubeck society. And the Buddenbrooks, clinging to their traditional values, find themselves increasingly at odds with this new, uncertain world.
It's almost symbolic, isn't it? Their world is literally crumbling around them.
Exactly. There's a powerful scene where the family is trapped in the assembly house during a riot. They're surrounded by an angry mob. Their sense of safety and privilege shattered.
This is one of the most famous passages in the book, right?
Yes, and it perfectly captures the anxieties of the time. The Buddenbrooks, once pillars of the community, are now targets of resentment. The old order is collapsing, and they're struggling to adapt.
So the revolution represents not just a political shift, but a cultural one as well.
Precisely, the values that once defined the Buddenbrooks' hard work, discipline, social responsibility are being challenged by new ideas, new ways of thinking, and they're not alone in this struggle. Other families in Lubeck, other institutions are also facing this existential crisis.
So it's a story about individual decline, but also about the decline of a whole way of life.
Exactly. And that decline manifests in different ways for each member of the Buddenbrook family. Tony's brother Christian, for example, lacks the discipline and business acumen of his father. He's a dreamer, an artist at heart, drawn to the pleasures of the world rather than the responsibilities of commerce.
And that puts him at odds with Thomas,
Right.
right? The eldest son who feels the weight of carrying on the family legacy.
Yes. Thomas is the embodiment of Buddenbrook tradition. He's hardworking, responsible, determined to uphold the family name, but he's also rigid, unable to adapt to the changing times.
It's interesting how their different personalities reflect those larger societal tensions.
Absolutely. Christian represents the allure of modernity, the freedom and individuality that come with breaking free from tradition, but he's also self-destructive, unable to find his place in a world that no longer values his kind of free-spiritedness.
And Thomas, for all his efforts to maintain the family standing, ultimately fails as well.
He does his marriage to Gerda Arnoldson, a beautiful and talented musician. Initially seems like a strategic move to solidify the family's social position, but Gerda, with her artistic temperament and independent spirit, represents a world that Thomas can't fully grasp or control.
So even his attempts to strengthen the family through marriage end up backfiring.
In a way, yes, Gerda, like Tony, represents a challenge to the traditional Buddenbrook values. She's not interested in social climbing or maintaining appearances. She's an artist, a free spirit, and her presence disrupts the carefully constructed order of the Buddenbrook household.
It seems like Mann is suggesting that even within the family, there's this clash between the old and the new, between tradition and modernity.
Precisely, and it's within this context that Hannah Thomas and Gerda's son is born.
Hanno, you've mentioned him before as a tragic figure. Why is he so significant to the story?
Hanno is the last hope of the Buddenbrook line. He's the heir apparent, the one who carries the weight of the family legacy on his fragile shoulders.
But he's not cut out for that role, is he?
No. Hanno is sensitive, artistic, more like his mother than his father. He's drawn to music, to beauty, to the things that Thomas sees as frivolous and unimportant.
It's almost like he's doomed from the start.
In a way, yes, Hanno embodies the decline of the Buddenbrooks, the gradual weakening of the family line. He's physically frail, prone to illness, and his sensitive nature makes him ill-suited for the harsh realities of the business world that his father represents.
It sounds like Hanno represents the fading spirit of the family, their inability to adapt to a world that no longer values what they represent.
That's a great way to put it, and Mann emphasizes this through a series of poignant scenes that highlight Hanno's sensitivity and artistic talent. There's one where young Hanno, deeply affected by a story he's read, interprets the suffering of a hunchback character with heartbreaking empathy.
He's almost too good for this world, isn't he? Too pure.
Precisely, and his piano playing, described as deeply moving and soulful, further underscores this. It's as though his music is a form of escape, a way to transcend the limitations of his fragile physical existence.
But even art can't save him, can it?
No. Hanno's fate is sealed. He dies in his teens after a short illness, leaving the Buddenbrook line extinguished. It's a quiet, almost anticlimactic ending, but one that speaks volumes about the inevitable passage of time and the futility of clinging to a past that's slipping away.
So the Buddenbrooks, once a symbol of prosperity and influence, are ultimately reduced to nothing.
Not entirely. Their physical presence may fade, but their story as told by Mann lives on, and in that sense they achieve a kind of immortality, albeit an unintended one. They become a symbol of a particular time and place, a reminder of the fragility of human ambition and the enduring power of storytelling.
You know, it's interesting. We've talked about the Buddenbrooks' decline, but Mann doesn't portray it as entirely negative. There are moments of liberation, of shedding the weight of tradition that come with their fall.
You're right. Think about Toni. Despite her unhappy first marriage and the constraints placed upon her, she finds a kind of contentment in her later life, embracing a simpler existence far removed from the grandeur of her youth.
And Christian, despite his flaws, embraces life with a certain zest that's missing in his more practical brother Thomas.
Exactly. It's as though Mann is suggesting that true happiness might lie not in clinging to the past, but in accepting the present with all its uncertainties and imperfections. The Buddenbrooks' decline, in a way, becomes a kind of rebirth, a chance for the surviving members to find their own paths, even if those paths deviate from the family's expectations.
So what does all of this mean for us, the readers, living in a world that's arguably changing even faster than the one Mann depicted?
Well, that's the beauty of Buddenbrooks. It's a timeless novel precisely because it speaks to universal themes. It forces us to confront our own relationship to the past, to question whether we're clinging to outdated values or embracing new possibilities.
And it reminds us that change is inevitable. We can resist it, try to control it, but ultimately we're all swept along by the currents of history. Because it is how will we navigate those currents?
Exactly. Will we be like Thomas, clinging to the past until it destroys us? Or will we be like Toni, finding a way to adapt and create a new life for ourselves, even if it's not the life we initially envisioned?
Buddenbrooks is such a rich and complex work full of symbolism and nuanced characters. Is there anything else about the novel that you think our listeners should keep in mind as they reflect on this deep dive?
One thing that stands out is how Mann uses the concept of illness to represent the family's decline. It's not just Hannah who's physically frail. Throughout the novel, we see recurring instances of sickness, fatigue, and a general sense of malaise among the Buddenbrooks.
It's almost like their decline is both physical and spiritual, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And their declining health mirrors their waning influence in Lübeck society. It's as if their bodies are literally failing them as the world around them changes, as they struggle to adapt to new ways of thinking and being.
It's a powerful image, one that speaks to the interconnectedness of our physical and mental states and how they're influenced by the world around us.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that even in decline, even in the face of loss, there can be beauty, there can be growth, there can be a kind of redemption.
Well, that's quite a thought. To leave our listener with Buddenbrooks is a challenging book, a demanding book, but ultimately a rewarding one.
It's a book that stays with you, that makes you think about your own life, your own choices, your own legacy.
It's a story about a family, yes, but it's also a story about us, about the human condition, about the enduring power of time and the inevitability of change.
And it's a book that I believe has something to offer every reader, no matter where they are in their own life journey.
So to our listener, if you're looking for a book that will challenge you, move you, and make you think deeply about the world and your place in it, I highly recommend giving Buddenbrooks a try.
And if you've already read it, perhaps this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the novel, or maybe it sparked some new questions for you to ponder.
Either way, we hope you found this exploration of Buddenbrooks enriching and insightful. Until next time, happy reading.